Well, the title of my talk is Liberation Theology. Question.
What's your title?
We couldn't hear you.
Liberation.
You need to.
Liberation theology.
Liberation Theology question. And the reason that it is a question mark is there was a disconnect for me between my perception of what liberation theology was or is in Denver, what it might be, what I might have expected to encounter in Chiapas, and what the reality on the ground is in Chiapas. As some of you know, as most of you probably know, there's a phrase that says liberation theology basically is a preferential option for the poor. It's reading the Bible, it's reading the Gospels, it's living our lives to be disciples, and in the process of that, have a preferential option for the poor for whatever we do. But as you might expect, it's much more nuanced and layered and complex than just being able to spout a buzz phrase, a preferential option for the poor. With that, I'm going to read two short paragraphs from the seminal work on liberation theology by Gustavo Gutierrez. He put this together over many years. It was published by Orbis Books in 1970, but it predates that publication date. Poverty is an act of love and liberation. It has a redemptive value. If the ultimate cause of human exploitation and alienation is selfishness, the deepest reason for voluntary poverty is love of neighbor. Christian poverty has meaning only as a commitment of solidarity with the poor and with those who suffer misery and injustice. The commitment is to witness to the evil which has resulted from sin and a breach of communion. It is not a question of idealizing poverty, but rather of taking it on as it is, an evil, to protest against it and to struggle to abolish it. Christian poverty, an expression of love, is solidarity with the poor and is a protest against poverty. This is the concrete, contemporary meaning of the witness of poverty. It is a poverty lived not for its own sake, but rather as an authentic imitation of Christ. It is a poverty which means taking on the sinful human condition to liberate humankind from sin and all its consequences. We must pay special attention to the words we use. The term poor might seem not only vague and churchy, but also somewhat sentimental and ascetic. The poor person today is the oppressed one, the marginalized from society, the member of the proletariat struggling for the most basic rights, the exploited and plundered social class, the country struggling for its liberation. In today's world, the solidarity and protest of which we are speaking have an evident and inevitable political character insofar as they imply liberation. To be with the oppressed is to be against the oppressor. In our times and on our continent, to be in solidarity with the poor, understood in this way, means to run personal risks, even to put one's life in danger, as many people do on a daily basis in Chiapas. Many Christians and non-Christians are committed to the Latin American revolutionary process, who are committed to the Latin American revolutionary process, are running these risks on a daily basis. And so there are emerging new ways of living poverty, which are different from the classic renunciation of the goods of this world. That's just these are three 15-minute talks. I just want to give you a taste of maybe a little bit of academic background on liberation theology, but if you listen to the words, it's really where the rubber meets the road. So one aspect of the complexity of the lived experience of the daily life in the struggle, or Lo Cotidiano en la Lucha, was given voice, a theological voice, by the late Sister Ada Maria Izazi Diaz. I will call her Sister Ada Maria. And this, and we're going to hear from her in a minute or two, just a short 3-minute video. But this Lo Cotidiano en la Lucha is what I heard from the people in the communities of resistance, in the encampments, in the NGOs, in the civil associations in Chiapas, and especially in the human rights organizations and the women's rights and women's cooperatives. I was especially impressed with our 2 young compañeras, Libertad y Tania, from Otros Mundos. These were 2, what looked to me to be 20-something young women who were a 2nd generation of the Chiapas and the Zapatista revolution. They served as our dedicated facilitators, our encyclopedic narrators and inspirational guides, and any other words you want to conjure for people who could explain things to us, explain things both to us and about us to the communities, to incredibly diverse audiences. I was most impressed with the community dialogue and the dialectical sharing which everyone, and where everyone had an opportunity to share when we visited the communities, the encampments, the NGOs, the women's shelters, and the cooperatives. The hospitality of these folks was exemplary and generous. They fed us with what little they had to share. The people invited us to join them in their community circle. Everyone introduced themselves and said a bit about themselves. Once everyone was introduced and had a chance to just say, I'm Jim, I'm a retired engineer from Denver, some folks shared more deeply some of their stories, some parts just unaccountably tragic. Often it was tearful for both the speaker and the community of listeners. I was moved even in the midst of their daily struggles, sus lo cotidiano, when we hugged and I looked into their faces and eyes and saw a calm determination, a dedication to moving forward in a communal struggle, and a fierce happiness and joy. Yes, it is a fierce joy that these people have. They have a communal solidarity of purpose to live simple, sustainable lives. Lives that reflect their cultural and spiritual roots. A life of dignified work, free of the neoliberal capitalist entrapments that despoil their land, soil, air, and water and make sustainable living impossible. These people have been living, working, and evolving simple, sustainable living for many decades and centuries. They persist in the face of multinational corporations despoiling their water, their land, and air. With courage, solidarity of purpose, and a generosity of spirit, they continue to endure massacres, targeted assassinations. Berta in Honduras, Gustavo of Otros Mundo was wounded in that same attack that took Berta's life. And many other people, others less well known that we hardly hear about. Assaults, rape, destruction of homes, fires, subsistence gardens, crops, livestock, and more from paramilitaries under the guise of corporate security and the Mexican army and police. Their stories and courage are most compelling and inspiring. Maybe we can bring up Ada Maria. So let's see what Ada Maria has to say about Lo Cotidiano. Just to give you some context, this is a YouTube video of a convocation for women's ordination, and she's talking about mujerista theology, but she briefly alludes to a small bit on Lo Cotidiano, our daily life.
this movement. I had gotten involved thinking that we would get ordained within a decade or so, and then I could once again concentrate on working with the poor. But what if the involvement in the issue left me psychologically spent? I thought long and hard about the situation, and then one day while driving home from work in the middle of a snowstorm, three things became clear to me. First of all, I realized that sexism is a category of oppression and that it does not exist apart from poverty, but that it compounds poverty and vice versa. In those early years of work together with Rosalind Michelle-Reinhardt and Marjorie Tuitt, we designed a visual to explain the interconnections of sexism, racism, ethnic prejudice, and classism. Years later, reading Rosemary Radford Ruther, I learned what words to use when talking about what I had then realized. Second, as I slowly inched ahead on slippery roads, I could hear my mother saying the words with which she almost always ended her letters to me. As long as God gives us strength, the energy we need for the struggle, we will be all right. Mama has always insisted we should not ask God to free us from struggling, but rather we should be happy to have something to struggle for. What we need to do is to ask God to give us fuerzas para la lucha, strength for the struggle. Years later, I would work on developing la lucha as a category of analysis and as a theo-ethical category. Third, the snow-covered windshield of my car became like a movie screen where I could see my next-door neighbor in Lima, a woman who lived in extreme poverty yet never lost her sense of dignity and purposefulness of life. I remember the steadiness of her struggle. Day after day, she dealt with the reality of the present day and survived today in order to be able to face tomorrow. That reflection has led me to develop the category of lo cotidiano as the main site for the struggle, as the site that makes obvious oppression and at the same time illumines the preferred future for which we struggle. What I realized that day, I came to understand more and more as I shared and discussed it with my women friends in Rochester. From that day forward, I have never been scared of burning out. And as far as burning up, isn't that what life is all about? For me, life is about being passionate for justice. That is what fulfills me. That is what gives me energy and creativity.
Energy and creativity. The other expression I heard I used somewhere was lo cotidiano en la lucha, daily life in the struggle. So these were sort of my preconceived notions about liberation theology, and I have to say that I like telling people I'm a Christian liberation theology Catholic, you know, little badge of courage right there. Then I get to tell people or enlighten them, dispense wisdom about a preferential option for the poor, or the church in bed with the Cadillos of Central America, or shortage of vocations for priests over the years because the church had lost identity, or the lay catechist, or the popular movements in Nicaragua and El Salvador and elsewhere. Maybe just a itsy bit too much of spiritual problem. I wore it as a badge of honor, so I expected the people in the communities of resistance in Chiapas would be happy to call themselves or profess that they were liberation theology Christian Catholics, wearing their little badges of honor like me. The reality today in Chiapas is quite different. Although liberation theology has an authentic, historic, and evolutionary place in the struggle in Chiapas. Bishop. The good bishop. In 1959, Pope John XXIII named Samuel Ruiz Garcia the Bishop of Chiapas. A few years later, this same good Pope John convened the Second Vatican Council, and with his now famous admonition, opened the doors and windows of this old church and let in some fresh air. Well, Bishop Ruiz, who became known as Don Samuel, took him at his word and ran with him. Over the next 40 years, he took issue with the poverty of the indigenous peoples of Chiapas, his pasturing area. He became affectionately known as Tata or Tatik, which is Mayan, or another indigenous language that I can't remember, for father. In keeping with Mayan and other indigenous cultures, he included a ministry for Madre Tierra, Earth Mother. He broke with the dynamic of discrimination that prohibited Indios from walking on the sidewalk, and with local elite landowners close and cozy ties to church hierarchy. For this, he was branded a communist. He was in excellent company. There's a great quote from Archbishop Dom Helder Câmara of Brazil that goes something like, "When I fed the poor, I was a saint. When I asked why are they poor and why are they hungry, I was a communist." Over the next 40 years, Don Samuel opened the whole life of the church to the indigenous peoples, as opposed to them not being able to walk on the sidewalks. He let them overlay their indigenous cultural traditions, allowing them to participate in part on their own terms, as the church had done everywhere in Europe and America and Africa and Asia. He trained indigenous catechist instructors. He ordained married male indigenous deacons. And unwisely, this practice was banned by the Vatican after he retired in 1999. In 1974, he convened a conference of indigenous people, the first grassroots gathering of its kind in the Americas since the Europeans came here and invaded. His work sparked indigenous awareness and provided fertile ground for the EZLN uprising in 1994. According to Dominican Father Gonzalo Ituarte and others, after his 40 years of service to the indigenous peoples, organizing pastoral teams, catechist instructors, deacons, many of these same people served with the EZLN. Although it was clearly not his intention, if not for Don Samuel, there would be no EZLN, unquote. Now the reality about liberation theology on the ground today in Chiapas. Thanks to Anita of Natik and Gustavo of Otros Mundos. This was a conversation I had with them via email, trying to find out more of what's going on with liberation theology today. The phrase liberation theology is a bit out of date. After Don Samuel was replaced by a more traditional conservative bishop in 2000, it affected the entire region. As I stated before, the Vatican also cut back on some of Don Samuel's reforms. The new bishop was much more traditional and much more conservative and really not interested in this huge, large organizing, community organizing with indigenous peoples and continuing to encourage them to have a full life and community in the church and in Chiapas. There are complications publicly linking faith professions with organizing works today in Chiapas. When Anita and Lorena, one of our DU professors, visited Ana, director of Amigos de San Cristobal, Ana, the director, asserted that the EZLN was not the only game in town, that other diocesan groups, for example, Pueblo Creyente, a quasi-political organizing tool founded by the Jesuits to help with land and territory issues in the highland parishes. Non-Catholics are not welcome in this movement. It is not in any way open-minded or ecumenical. My response to that, reading that from Anita's email, is maybe this is the next challenge for the next Don Samuel. At that same meeting with Director Ana, Lorena mentioned Don Samuel being a liberation theologian. Ana quickly corrected her, denying it. But then Anita reminded Director Ana that if he was not a liberation theologian, he was at least acting out of the spirit and reforms of Vatican II. Many others who worked closely with Don Samuel in core communities openly identified with liberation theology back during the time that he served, the 40 years he served up until 1999. Ana did not appreciate Anita's reference to liberation theology. Anita shared that she's been to many Catholic and Protestant services over the years in Chiapas, and one discouraging commonality is that both groups vilify the other. Either you are with us or you are doomed. The others are wrong in all ways and under all circumstances. No religious tolerance or interfaith alliance. Enter another Don Samuel. There is no other Don Samuel yet, but they could use one. The Mexican government exploits this schism for community conflict. Thus, many people keep their faith private when working for non-religious and apolitical organizations. More traditional Catholic communities have been forcing Protestants out of their own villages since the 1980s. This tension became lethal in 1996 when an evangelical Presbyterian paramilitary massacred 42 men, women, and children of Abejas, a Catholic peace group, which means the bees, in the town of Actiel. And according to Anita, these stories go on and on. She sums up, liberation theology as a label has been too closely linked to revolutionary movements that people shy away from today. So liberation theology has had a profound influence in Chiapas. If we read the declarations from the Lacaton jungle, we hear echoes of Don Samuel's ministry and service to the indigenous peoples. And I'm going to read a sample from the first letter, which was the Declaration of War. Now, Don Samuel didn't approve of armed resistance, but the echoes are unmistakable. To the people of Mexico, we are a product of 500 years of struggle. We have been denied the most elemental preparation as they use us as cannon fodder and pillage the wealth of our country. They don't care that we have nothing, absolutely nothing, not even a roof over our heads, no land, no work, no health care, no food nor education, nor are we able to freely and democratically elect our political representatives, nor is there independence from foreigners, nor is there peace nor justice for ourselves and our children. We are the inheritors of the true builders of our nation. The dispossessed, we are millions, and we thereby call upon our brothers and sisters to join this struggle against the same ones that oppose the petroleum expropriation, the same ones that massacred the railroad workers in 1958 and the students in 1968. I was in college in 1968, and I remember the student riots in Mexico City. And the same ones that take everything from us, absolutely everything. To the people of Mexico, we, the men and women, full and free, are conscious that the war that we have declared is our last resort, but it is also a just one. The dictators are applying an undeclared genocidal war against our people, or have been for many years. Therefore, we ask for your participation, your decision, to support this plan that struggles for work, for land, housing, food, health care, education, independence, freedom, democracy, justice, and peace. When I'm struggling with my paradigm about liberation theology. What does it really mean to me? And a dear friend of mine just passed away, Bill Lewis. He was a campus minister at Ohio State. And, he would say, when people would ask him, when he explained his Christianity, he says, well, I'm a disciple. I follow Jesus because he taught us what it means to be truly human. And so for me, what it means to be truly human is the Sermon on the Mount and the Gospel of Matthew and the least of these. Blessed are the poor, blessed are the meek, the mournful, the merciful. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for justice for righteousness' sake. Blessed are the pure in heart, the peacemakers, and blessed are those who are persecuted while trying to live this out. And then the 7 extra-corporal mercy: when I was hungry, when I was thirsty, when I was naked, when I was homeless, when I was a stranger, the immigrant, when I was in prison, and when I was sick. Now, I'm the first to admit I fall short every day. But that's sort of my rock, and that's where I'm at right now with trying to reconcile my notions, my preconceived notions of liberation theology in Chiapas, and what the reality is on the ground today. And that's really all I have.